Why Nation Failed by Acemoglu and Robinson. Chapter 12, The Vicious Circle. The authors explain how institutions that create poverty generate negative feedback loops and endure. This chapter covers the following topics. You can't take the train to Bo anymore. From Encomienda to land grab. From slavery to Jim Crow. The iron law of oligarchy. Negative feedback and vicious circles. The authors continue with the violent circle, Sierra Leone's colonial rule and the role of the British. The violent circle, Sierra Leone's colonial rule and the role of the British. Sierra Leone became a British colony in 1896, initially composed of small African kingdoms. The British extended their rule into the interior through treaties with African rulers in the second half of the 19th century. The Hut tax rebellion was defeated, but warned the British about controlling the Sierra Leonean hinterland. The British started building a railway from Freetown into the interior, which was stopped by the native insurrection in February 1898. After the rebellion, the railway was changed to go south, via Roti-Funk, and onto Bo, into Mendiland. Sir Milton Margai and his Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP, took power after Sierra Leone became independent in 1961. Stevens's strategy of extracting resources from the people and setting up a violent dictatorship after 1967 consolidated his power. The British used an indirect rule system, with paramount chiefs collecting taxes, distributing justice, and keeping order. Colonial rule and agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. Colonial rule and marketing boards. Colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa extracted farmers' income, with palm kernel farmers receiving 56% of the world price from the marketing board by the mid-1960s. By 1985, these numbers dropped to 37, 19, and 27%, indicating 90% of the farmers' income was extracted by the British government. The office of the Premier Chief. The British stipulated that the office of the paramount chief would be held for life, with eligibility based on king's lineage and elite families' treaties. The tribal authority, appointed by paramount chiefs, decided who would become the paramount chief. Agricultural productivity and marketing boards. The behavior of marketing boards and traditional land ownership systems contribute to low agricultural productivity. Pricing policies removed incentives for farmers to invest, use fertilizers, or preserve the soil. Mineral resources management. The British government established a monopoly for the Sierra Leone Selection Trust, granted to De Beers, leading to conflict and chaos. In 1970, Siaka Stevens nationalized the Sierra Leone Selection Trust, creating the National Diamond Mining Company, Sierra Leone, Limited. 19th century Australia's gold mining and colonial rule. Gold mining in Australia. Gold discovered in 1851 in New South Wales and Victoria, Australia. Proposals for a monopoly model were made, but free access to mining areas prevailed. Inclusive Model 1, allowing anyone who paid an annual mining license fee to search and dig for gold. Diggers played a powerful role in Australian politics, especially in Victoria. Effects of European expansion and colonial rule in Africa. Transatlantic slave trade encouraged the development of extractive African political and economic institutions. Colonial legislation and institutions eliminated African commercial agriculture development. Slavery in Sierra Leone. No strong centralized state, just many small, antagonistic kingdoms. Disease environment prevented large-scale white settlement. Lack of mining economy led to no incentive for extractive labor market institutions. Indirect rule in Sierra Leone. British base indirect rule on indigenous institutions and introduced social stratification, ruling houses, and a hereditary aristocracy. Colonial and independent Sierra Leone, a continuity. British marketing boards used to tax farmers. Post-colonial governments used the same extractive system at higher rates. British set up a diamond monopoly to keep out African miners. Absence of an army undermined the regime. The vicious circle. British colonial authorities built extractive institutions, leading to post-independence African politicians. Extractive political institutions lead to extractive economic institutions, enriching a few at the expense of many. Extractive political institutions and power abuse. Lack of checks against power abuses. Examples include Franklin Roosevelt's presidential powers and Sam Bangura's murder in Sierra Leone. Create a vicious circle, increasing potential stakes and income inequality. Control of the state benefits those controlling it, creating incentives for infighting. Seeds of power struggles and civil wars, causing economic ruin and human suffering. Guatemala's elite dominance and economic development. Ramiro de Leon Carpio, Richard Aitkenhead Castillo, and Ricardo Castillo Sinibaldi, descendants of Spanish conquistadors, were appointed as presidents in 1993. The elite controlled and monopolized trade through the Consulado de Comercio. The elite maintained extractive economic institutions of the colonial era, even under a republican government. The elite viewed the Cadiz Constitution with hostility, leading to their declaration of independence. The Consulado remained in charge of the country's economic development, but had its own interests. The elite dominance resulted in Guatemala being caught in a time warp in the middle of the 19th century, as technological innovations and rising incomes in Western Europe and North America created a mass demand for many products. Guatemala's coffee boom and the influence of the liberals. The rise of coffee production led to the spread of cultivation without the Consulado's assistance. The Guatemalan liberals maintained extractive political institutions and reorganized the economy to exploit coffee. The liberals pushed for land privatization, capturing previously held communal or government land. The elite used the coercive power of the liberal state to gain access to labor through various systems of forced labor. The repartimento, a forced labor draft, was institutionalized in 1877 and extended to include forced labor and the use of a workbook. The role of the elite. The Guatemalan elite ruled by a military strongman, continuing to do so after the coffee boom. Jorge Ubico, president between 1931 and 1944, ruled longest, opposing industry and banning the use of words such as obreros, sindicatos, and hulgas. Spanish conquistadors' extractive political and economic system in the New World. Spanish conquistadors established temporary institutions like the Encomienda, granting rights over labor. The institutions changed over time, but the extractive nature remained. In Guatemala, the encomienda, repartimento, and monopolization of trade replaced with the libreta and land grab. Indigenous Maya continued as low-wage laborers with little education, rights, and public services. Economic and political institutions in the U.S. South. Extractive institutions persisted from colonial to modern times, with the same elite in control. Slaves had no political or economic rights, and their rights were minimal. The South lacked industry and made little investment in infrastructure. The South was not innovative in its specialized sectors. The Civil War led to the abolishment of slavery and the right to vote for black men. Jim Crow refers to segregationist legislation enacted in the South after 1865. Despite the abolishment of slavery and the right to vote, the economic and political trajectory of the South remained unchanged. Persistence of the planter elite in southern Alabama. Jonathan Weiner's study showed 101 members of the planter elite in 1870 maintained their position, similar to pre-Civil War times. Despite the Civil War, planter elite suffered few casualties, ensuring the persistence of the plantation economy. After the war, elite planters regained control over the labor force, maintaining the economic system based on plantation agriculture and cheap labor. The Black Code of Alabama, passed in 1865, aimed to repress black labor and ensure a reliable low-cost labor pool for Southern planters. The period called Reconstruction lasted from 1865 until 1877, marked by a systematic backlash from the Southern elite. Jim Crow laws and apartheid in the South. Jim Crow laws led to separate, inferior schools for white and colored children. Alabama's constitution mandates the establishment and maintenance of a public school system for children aged 7 to 21. The Ku Klux Klan's actions, often financed by the elite, aimed to control the black population and its labor. Southern politicians in Washington worked to maintain the extractive institutions of the South, ensuring no federal projects or public works that would have threatened the black workforce were approved. Historical overview of the Iron Law of Oligarchy. The Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia was overthrown by a military coup in 1974 led by the Derg. Emperor Haile Selassie was a dictator who ran the country as his own private property. The Derg declared Ethiopia a socialist state by December 1974. Selassie died, likely murdered, on August 27, 1975. In 1975, the Derg nationalized property, sparking opposition and splitting into factions. Major Mengistu emerged as the most ruthless leader of the Derg, eliminating major opponents by mid-1977. The regime was saved from collapse by a massive influx of weapons and troops from the Soviet Union and Cuba in November of that year. Around 1978, materialism became accepted and required, with designer clothes for senior government officials and members of the military council. The Iron Law of Oligarchy, a violent circle in Africa. The transition between Haile Selassie and Mengistu is described as a vicious circle. Oligarchies will reproduce themselves even when a new group takes control. Post-independence leaders of Africa often use the same patronage networks and manipulate markets and resources as colonial regimes and emperors they replaced. The transition was more tragic than the original tragedy, with leaders murdering opponents and innocent citizens, and recurring famines. Radical changes and political institutions. The Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution were radical changes that led to significant political revolutions. New merchants and businessmen sought to unleash creative destruction, preventing the development of extractive institutions. The Glorious Revolution was backed by merchants, industrialists, gentry, and diverse political groups. The history of English and French political institutions paved the way for new, inclusive regimes. The French Revolution saw a narrow group under Robespierre and Saint-Just take control, but this was temporary. Societies with long histories of extreme extractive institutions had no checks on rulers' power, making it harder to resist and move towards inclusive institutions. Post-colonial African independence led to economic growth through state planning and cultivation of the private sector. The benefits from holding power attracted unscrupulous men and brought the worst out of them once in power. The vicious circle and inclusive institutions. Role of inclusive institutions. Rich nations have developed inclusive institutions over the past 300 years. These institutions generate positive feedback, increasing their inclusiveness. Inclusive political institutions create constraints against power usurpation. Inclusive economic institutions support the continuation of inclusive political institutions. Persistence of extractive institutions. Violent circles create powerful forces towards the persistence of extractive institutions. Extractive political institutions forge extractive economic institutions, creating the basis for the persistence of extractive political institutions. The Iron Law of Oligarchy. The overthrow of a regime over extractive institutions leads to the arrival of new masters. Extractive political institutions create few constraints on power exercise. The empowerment of a broad coalition can replace absolutist institutions with more inclusive, pluralistic ones. The destructive facet of the violent circle. Extractive institutions create inequalities and wealth, leading to continuous infighting and civil wars. Thank you.